WrestleMania 37. It's just a month away and I am hyped. So I thought I might share the hype with you guys by talking about WrestleMania's past. We're going all the way back to the Hulkster and Mr. T versus Paul Orndorff and Roddy Piper, to Edge and Roman Reigns. But first things first, we still need to talk about these two gentlemen and everybody that came under them. And how fucking boring they all were. WrestleMania 1 is so goddamn boring. Watch Ricky Steamboat versus Matt Bourne. Skip the rest. If you really want to, watch the main event, Mr. T and Hulk Hogan, and skip the fucking rest. You will have not wasted any time. You will have not missed anything. It is so goddamn boring. Late, says the White Rabbit. Let's talk about Mania 2. What's interesting about WrestleMania 2 is that it was actually a simulcast event where there was a card that took place in New York City, in Chicago, and Los Angeles. Each card had a different celebrity doing guest commentary. I didn't really recognize the two ladies who were on commentary for New York and Chicago, but Los Angeles had frickin' Elvira, and she was awesome. As far as the actual matches go, they weren't much better than Mania 1, but the tag team match between the Dream Team and the British Bulldogs was pretty great. It was especially fun because the British Bulldogs were managed for the match by frickin' Ozzy Osbourne. There was also a pretty good match with Hercules Hernandez and Ricky Steamboat, but that's it. That's all you need to see. Watching every single WrestleMania and giving you all my thoughts on them, Part 3. Today, we obviously have WrestleMania 3, which featured the big match between Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant. But alas, this was not the only match on that card. We also had the ever-so-incredible match between the Macho Man Randy Savage and Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, which was a classic. Many people say it's a classic, and they're all right. But also within the card, we had an interesting storyline about how Brutus the Beefcake became the Barber. Earlier in the night, Brutus had a match with his teammate, and he won it, but he didn't really like how he and his teammate had won. So they kicked him out, and he went and joined forces with Roddy Piper at the end of his hair versus hair match with Adrian Adonis. But of course, the match we all remember is Hogan versus Andre, where at the end of it, Hogan picks up Andre and slams him into the mat. It's as epic in 2021 as it was in 1980. I'm discussing every WrestleMania ever. Now we're time for WrestleMania 4. Interestingly, this poster is a lie, but also not. The actual main event was between the Macho Man Randy Savage and the $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase. But Hogan and Andre had already had a match earlier in the night, and they were also in Randy and Ted's corners, helping their buddies out. There are 3 matches I really recommend from this card. The main event, the Tag Team Championship match between Strikeforce and Demolition, and the qualifying match between Rick Rude and Jake Roberts. What was interesting about this whole card is it was actually a tournament all in one night. Randy's match with Ted here was actually his 5th of the night. He worked his ass off to get that title. He deserves it. Look at this prep. I'm discussing every WrestleMania. Now it's time for Part 5. Quick history lesson. After WrestleMania 4, Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage started teaming up. But the thing is, Randy Savage, he's a very jealous man. And he was thinking that Hogan here was taking a look at his little wifey here. And he didn't like that. Not one bit. So they had a match at WrestleMania 5 for the WWF Championship. It wound up being a pretty great match, but we also had a match between the Blue Blazer and Mr. Perfect, a match between the Hart Foundation and the Honky Tonk Man and his buddy Greg Valentine, and an Intercontinental title match between Rick Rude and the Ultimate Warrior. There were a few pretty darn good matches at this particular WrestleMania. Check it out if you got the network. It's really good stuff. Also, Miss Elizabeth was a nice lady. I'm discussing every single WrestleMania. Now it's time for Part 6. The main event here, as you can tell, was Hogan versus the Ultimate Warrior, and it was a pretty okay match in my opinion, but I've heard more people say more positive things than I have to say. So if you like it, more power to you. I'm not as much a fan. A match I really dug, though, was Jake the Snake Roberts versus the $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase. Just lovely stuff. Another match I really dug was Dusty Rhodes here and his valet, Sapphire, versus Randy Savage here and his valet, Sensational Sherry. One last match I want to talk about, Colossal Connection versus Demolition. The match itself is really good, but the really memorable thing was Andre and Bobby the Heenan breaking up, where Andre said, "Enough!" Alright, Mania Series Part 7. The main event for this one was Hulk Hogan, the Real American, versus Sergeant Slaughter, the literal G.I. Joe character that they turned into a heel, an Iraqi sympathizer heel, in 1991, during the Persian Gulf War. The Gulf War ended literally a month before Mania 7 aired. Fuck. My suggestion, watch until the end of Ultimate Warrior vs. Randy Savage. Cry your tears of joy when the Macho Man reunites with Miss Elizabeth. Then, turn the fucking TV off because everything before Savage and Warrior is great. Everything else, I'm discussing every WrestleMania. Now it's time for Part 8. Main event. Ric Flair versus Randy Savage, and also Hulk Hogan versus Sid Justice. Hogan versus Justice closed the show. It was okay, but the ending is a real stinker. Don't watch it. Now Savage versus Flair, on the other hand, that was pretty good. Although there's kind of a gross thing that happens after the actual match ends. You see Flair over there, he was kind of a perv. And at the end of the match, he kissed Randy's wife, Miss Elizabeth, without her permission. If you're not cool with that, don't watch this either. The only match on this card that I can recommend without any caveats is Bret Hart versus Roddy Piper. Really good, really great stuff. Check it out for the IC title. I'm discussing every single WrestleMania. Now it's time for Part 9. You know, this one actually has a really bad reputation off of really 2 matches, and those are pretty bad matches, I'll admit it. The first one was Giant Gonzalez versus The Undertaker, the third match in The Undertaker's legendary undefeated streak of WrestleMania. It ended because Big Fucker here fucking put a chloroform rag over The Undertaker's face. The other really awful match was Hogan beating Yokozuna for the WWF Championship after Bret Hart had just lost it to him after a 9-minute encounter. This was Yokozuna, by the way. He was a big boy. But honestly, I think the rest of the card gets kind of a bum rap because of those 2 matches. I find the rest of the show really enjoyable, especially the Headshrinkers versus the Steiners. Check that one out. I'm discussing every single WrestleMania. Now it's time for Part 10. I'm fucking screwed with this one. There's no way this one's gonna get any views. No Hogan, no Andre, no Ultimate Warrior. Piper's here, Savage is here, but they're not that important. So technically, this one's a double main event with Lex Luger facing Yokozuna in halfway through the show, and then at the end of the show, Bret Hart faces Yoko. The reason they both got to fight Yoko in one night is because during the 1994 Royal Rumble, Luger and Bret both managed to finish first because they eliminated each other at the end. The opener for this one was Owen versus Bret Hart. Real good shit. The semi-main event was a ladder match between Razor Ramon and Shawn Michaels here. It was only the second ladder match in company history. I'm discussing every single WrestleMania. This is Part 11, and I'm not getting out of bed for it. Why? because it doesn't fucking deserve it. The main event for this one was NFL football star Lawrence Taylor versus Bam Bam Bigelow. Yeah, that's why it doesn't deserve it. The match before it was a title match between Diesel and Shawn Michaels. It was okay. There was also a tag team title match between the Smoking Guns against Yokozuna and Owen Hart here. He's cut off. That was actually a pretty good match. Check that one out. There was also a pretty decent match between the Allied Powers, Lex Luger and the British Bulldog, against the Blue Brothers. You can check that one out too if you'd like. A not so great match was The Undertaker versus King Kong Bundy. Skip it. The streak wasn't that great. I'm discussing every single WrestleMania. Now it's time for part 12. While there were other matches on this card, I don't think it would really be unfair to call it a one-match card when the one match took place for half the goddamn show. Said match being Bret Hart versus Shawn Michaels in a 60-minute Iron Man match that went on for an hour and 2 minutes. So yeah, it didn't just go for a full 60. It went over. And it went over because it was fucking awesome. That said, if you feel so inclined, please check out Undertaker versus Diesel. That's actually a really good match. Really, most of the card is pretty good, save for Hunter Hearst Helmsley versus Ultimate Warrior. That's a blatant squash with one of the least talented workers in WWE, so skip that one. Everything else, check it out. Check it out. I'm still discussing every single WrestleMania, and now it's time for part 13. The main event for this one was Psycho Sid versus The Undertaker, but fuck off. We know what the real main event was. Bret Hart versus Stone Cold Steve Austin, with special guest referee, the most dangerous man in the world, and UFC Hall of Famer, Ken Shamrock. This legendary match is enough reason to watch WrestleMania 13, but I got a couple extra reasons for you if you'd like. Triple H versus Goldust, another great match that you should totally watch. Also check out the British Bulldog and Owen Hart versus Mankind and Big Van Vader. But again, I need to make this clear. If you only watch one match from WrestleMania 13, make it Bret the Hitman Hart versus... I am discussing every single WrestleMania, and now it's time for WrestleMania 14. The main event for this one was Shawn Michaels versus Stone Cold Steve Austin, with special guest enforcer Iron Mike Tyson. While these three were the main event, and they were, for my money, the match of the night, they were not, in fact, the only match of the night. That also belongs to The Rock versus, once again, the baddest man on the planet, the most dangerous man on the planet, I should say, Kenneth Shamrock. One more match I really recommend, Triple H versus Owen Hart for the WWF European Championship. But if you only got time for one, you can't exactly go wrong with all this. You really can't. I'm discussing every single WrestleMania. Now it's time for WrestleMania 15. The main event for this one was The Rock versus Stone Cold Steve Austin, the first in a trilogy of matches that would also happen at Mania 17 and Mania 19. This was their first, and it was freaking epic. Interestingly, there was also a match lower on the card between The Big Show and Mankind to see who would be the special guest referee for Rock versus Austin. Naturally, because he's a complete professional, Mankind dressed for the job he wanted, and he got the job he wanted. This Mania also saw one of the more infamous matches in The Undertaker's famous streak. Taker's opponent this time was the Big Boss Man, and at the end of their match, he had Big Boss Man hung from the roof of the cell at Hell in a Cell. The match itself was pretty okay, but if you're not down with this, I don't blame you. Rest of the show, though, thumbs up. I'm discussing every single WrestleMania. Now it's time for part 2000. Wait, what? What? Yeah, this one came out in the year 2000, so like every other thing from the year 2000, or 1999 for that matter, it's not called WrestleMania 16, it's called WrestleMania 2000. It's cut off, but I promise you it's there. As you can see here, the main event for this one was a four-way elimination match between Triple H, The Rock, Mick Foley, and The Big Show. There's some shenanigans at the end, but overall, it's a really good match. Check it out. Another match you should really check out, the Dudleys versus the Hardys versus Edge and Christian in a ladder match for the tag team titles. Beautiful. And that's about all I really can recommend because Jesus Christ, this was a misogynistic mess. Like, ugh. I'm discussing every WrestleMania, and now it's time for WrestleMania X7. I have heard a lot of people call this the best WrestleMania of all time, and having just watched it, I'm not sure if I disagree. It's pretty awesome. As you can see, the headlining match for this one was The Rock versus Stone Cold. They previously wrestled at Mania 15, and it was a pretty good match, but this one was... And that's not even getting into the TLC match here between the Hardys, the Dudleys, and Edge and Christian, because... Oh Lord. But at the same time, every other match on this card was good. Every single match was either really good, kind of good, or really fucking awesome. The Hardcore Championship match was really good. The Undertaker and Triple H's first match together was really good. The only match I feel like I can't recommend is Benoit versus Angle, because Benoit is... I'm discussing every single WrestleMania. Today I'm discussing Mania 18. What's interesting here is that the poster actually does not show the main event. Rock versus Hulk Hogan was not the main event. The main event was Chris Jericho versus Triple H. But in the end, both matches were great, so who the hell gives a shit? I've never really liked Hulk Hogan at all, but him versus The Rock here, it really was a good match. DDP versus Christian and RVD versus William Regal were also damn great stuff. Kurt Angle versus Kane, fantastic. Flair versus Taker, actually not that great in my opinion. People often talk about how WWE doesn't put that much emphasis on the tag division, and they're right, but the tag matches at WrestleMania, they're often pretty awesome in my opinion, at least these ones. Discussing every single WrestleMania, and now it's time for part 19. Shit. The most special thing about this Mania is that this was the end of Rock and Austin's WrestleMania trilogy, and this is the one where Austin did the job for Rock. This is the one where Stone Cold laid down for his longtime rival and took the 1, 2, 3. We also saw the beginning of Brock Lesnar's illustrious career at big matches on pay-per-view. Note that I very deliberately said pay-per-view and not WrestleMania. We also saw the infamous Chris Jericho go up against the equally infamous Shawn Michaels at his return match. We also saw a pretty great match with a pretty awful finish between Booker T and Triple H. Seriously, Hunter, what the fuck? We also saw the great Rey Mysterio make his Mania debut against Matt Hardy, which was... I'm discussing every single WrestleMania. Now I'm talking about WrestleMania 20, where it all begins again. This one actually starts with John Cena versus The Big Show for the United States title, and you can tell it's early on in John's career because you're not getting the dueling, "Let's go Cena! Cena sucks!" chants. It's all just, "Let's go Cena!" This also saw The Rock's last match for a good long time. It was The Rock and Sock Connection in a 2-on-3 match against Evolution, and it was real good stuff. This card also saw Eddie Guerrero versus Kurt Angle in a classic match that I will not spoil for you because, God yes. This card also saw the return of The Undertaker as the dead man who had been, for the longest time, wrestling as the American Badass, a biker character. And this was really great stuff. A pretty infamously poor match, though. Goldberg versus Brock. I'm discussing every single WrestleMania ever. Now it's time for part 21. This show was a good one, too. We had another great contest between Rey Mysterio and Eddie Guerrero. Rest in peace. The first ever Money in the Bank ladder match, which was fucking phenomenal. One of the better, if not the best, matches of the Undertaker's streak against Randy Orton. You had the coming out parties of Dave Bautista and John Cena against Triple H and JBL. And in the middle of all that, you had the best goddamn match of the night between Shawn Michaels and Kurt fucking Angle. Just magnificent work. Magnificent. You also had the Big Show against a real-life sumo wrestler named Akibono, which was weird, but not bad, actually. I'm discussing every WrestleMania, and now it's time for part 22. First things first, this poster, it's a lie. Booker T and John Cena do not face off in this Mania. I don't think they even see each other in a cutscene or anything during this show. Booker T and his wife Sharmell, they actually went head-to-head with the Boogeyman here. It wasn't a good match. On the other hand, went head-to-head with Triple H, and yeah, this is familiar territory. A much more divided crowd than WrestleMania 21. The moment of the night, though, has to be Rey Mysterio winning the World Heavyweight Championship. This was a few months after Eddie Guerrero had passed, and he and Rey were always good friends, so this was a nice moment for Rey. Also, the Money in the Bank ladder match is always fucking great. And you know what else was actually fucking great? Trish versus Mickie James. That was a really good match. Like, wow. I'm discussing every WrestleMania. Now it's time for part 23. Yeah, Donald Trump is in this one. The match he's technically part of is really great, probably because he doesn't actually fight. It's between Umaga and Bobby Lashley, which is fucking great. But if you don't want to watch it, I completely understand. Fuck Trump. That said, the two title matches, fucking awesome. The Money in the Bank match is really great, especially because it sees the debut at Mania of my boy, CM Punk. A match I want to recommend is Chris Benoit versus MVP, but a few months after this, Benoit did a really awful thing, like really awful. A match I'm not conflicted about, the ECW Originals versus the New Breed. Skip this one, it's a blatant burial, it fucking sucks, don't watch it. I'm discussing every WrestleMania, now it's time for WrestleMania 24. Unlike previous posters, this one is completely honest. Well, not entirely. From this poster, you would think the main event is Big Show versus Floyd Mayweather. It's not. The main event is Edge versus Taker. Floyd and Big Show are second to last, and third to last are Cena, Randy, and Triple H. I have quibbles when it comes to Show and Floyd, but otherwise, all great matches, all great. We also saw the Money in the Bank ladder match, which saw a victory from my man, CM Punk. And of course, on this card, you have the legendary Ric Flair's retirement match, with Shawn Michaels' legendary last words. I'm sorry. I love you. There was also a hilarious match where Kane buried the fuck out of Chavo Guerrero. I'm discussing every WrestleMania. Now it's time for part 25. There were three main event matches for this show. Shawn Michaels versus The Undertaker, John Cena versus The Big Show versus Edge, and Triple H versus Randy Orton. This was during a fairly infamous angle where basically Randy beat the fuck out of every single McMahon, including Stephanie. And so then Triple H literally burst into Randy's house and beat him up. Fucking wrestling, am I right? All the main event matches were really great. Check them all out. This WrestleMania also marked CM Punk becoming the first ever two-time winner of the Money in the Bank ladder match at WrestleMania. This one also marked the rather abrupt retirement of JBL. Surprisingly solid matchup between Jericho and Steamboat. I'm discussing every WrestleMania. Now it's time for WrestleMania 26. The main events for this show were Shawn Michaels versus The Undertaker, Batista versus John Cena, and Triple H versus Sheamus, who I guess wasn't big enough to get on the poster yet. Also on this card was Rey Mysterio versus CM Punk. The stipulation was that if Rey lost, he would join the Straight Edge Society, and Rey accepted the challenge because Punk made his daughter cry on her birthday, and that's fucking unforgivable. Also on this card was Bret Hart versus Vince McMahon, a little revenge for the Montreal Screwjob. We also saw the one and only Edge versus the great Chris Jericho. But of course, if you're going to talk about Mania 26, you need to talk about the fact that it was Shawn Michaels' last match. He never wrestled any other match. There was no Saudi Arabia match. I'm discussing every WrestleMania. Now it's time for Part 7. The main event for this one was John Cena versus The Miz. But the thing is, the ending to this match, and kind of the whole show, is a setup for John Cena versus The Rock at next year's WrestleMania. The match itself technically ends in a double countout, but is then restarted, and then it ends with Rock giving Cena the rock bottom and Miz covering him. The matches you should really check out, though, are Rey Mysterio versus Cody Rhodes. I wonder where that guy went. CM Punk versus Randy Orton, and Triple H versus The Undertaker. And also, Edge's last match for 9 straight years against Alberto Del Rio. Don't watch Michael Cole versus Jerry Lawler, though. Just save yourself the trouble. Don't. I'm discussing every WrestleMania. Now it's time for WrestleMania 28. Once in a lifetime. The tagline is a fucking lie. They did this again the very next year. The once in a lifetime match in question is, of course, John Cena versus The Rock. And it was pretty goddamn awesome. My only quibble, Cena should have won. Not because Rock is bad, but because Rock is a part-timer. I always say give it to the guy who's here every week. That's my take. Other matches that I highly recommend, CM Punk versus Chris Jericho, and Triple H versus The Undertaker. A match you should probably skip, Daniel Bryan versus Sheamus, because it goes like this. Kiss, kick, 1, 2, 3, and your winner, and new World Heavyweight Champion, Sheamus! I'm discussing every WrestleMania. Now it's time for WrestleMania 29. The main event for this one was John Cena versus The Rock, again, but this time for the WWE Championship. Consensus? Yeah, check it out. Check it out. Cena gets his win back, so that's a good thing. A match you really ought to check out, though, is CM Punk versus The Undertaker. This was the last match of The Undertaker's streak before it got broke by Brock the next year, in the next Mania. You should also check out the 6-man tag match, The Shield versus Randy Orton, The Big Show, and Sheamus. It's also pretty good stuff. Check that one out. Another match you should really check out is Team Hell No versus Dolph and Big E. There's actually some really good heel work from Dolph. He makes a point of giving AJ Lee a quick smooch before the match. Now, where have we seen that before? I'm discussing a WrestleMania. Now it's time for WrestleMania XXX. Wait, what? The main event for this one was Batista versus Randy Orton versus the winner of Daniel Bryan and Triple H. Both those matches were pretty freaking epic, with one spot where Batista has whoever set up for a Batista bomb, and Randy grabs them and turns it into a fucking RKO. Just wah. A little lower on the card, we saw Bray Wyatt versus John Cena. A pretty good match, but if I were to quibble, I would have said that Wyatt should have went over, not John. The Undertaker's streak here was ended by Brock Lesnar, and to be honest, I'm not sure if I wanted it to end. It was a fine match, but I don't think I wanted it to end. Another pretty noteworthy match, Paige versus basically the entire Divas division. Check that one out. I'm discussing every WrestleMania. Now it's time for WrestleMania 31. The one which saw the WWE in-ring debut of fucking Sting. It It was a fucking epic match, but Sting should have gone over. Triple H should have given the win to Sting here. That would have made the most sense. This WrestleMania is also infamous for another match. The main event for this one was Roman Reigns versus Brock Lesnar. But all of a sudden you hear Seth Rollins' music. He runs out and cashes in his Money in the Bank contract, making the match a triple threat and then stealing basically the WWE Championship from Brock and Roman. It was awesome. It was epic. This Mania also saw a ladder match for the Intercontinental Championship, which was awesome. This Mania also featured probably Randy Orton's best RKO against Seth Rollins. I'm discussing every WrestleMania. Now it's time for part 32. The main event for this one was Roman Reigns versus Triple H, the WWE Champion. It was okay. On the subject of matches you should absolutely check out, watch the ladder match for the Intercontinental title. That was won by Zack Ryder here, but it was awesome, so who the hell cares won. You should also check out Chris Jericho versus AJ Styles. This was AJ's Mania debut, and it was a good one. It was a real good one. And I can't highly recommend the women's match enough. This is probably the first really good women's match since, I guess, Mickey versus Trish at Mania 21. A match with a bad rep that I actually really liked. Dean Ambrose versus Brock. And look, credit to the 46-year-old, but don't watch Shane versus Taker. I'm discussing every WrestleMania. Now it's time for part 33. The main event for this one was Roman Reigns versus The Undertaker, and it was probably Taker's weakest match post-streak. You could tell Taker was kind of out of shape, and you could tell Roman was trying to do a lot for the match. I don't fault Roman or Taker for the match, but I think it's understandable why Taker wanted to retire after this. This Mania saw the return of the Hardy Boys after a good 7 years since they last met in WWE. It was a ladder match for the tag team titles, and it was fucking awesome. Check this one out. Other matches you want to check out: John Cena and Nikki Bella versus The Miz and Maurice, Bayley versus Nia Jax versus Sasha versus Charlotte, and Owens versus Jericho. All great matches. I'm discussing every WrestleMania. Now it's time for WrestleMania 34. The main event for this one was Roman Reigns versus Brock Lesnar, but we'll come back to it. The match I want to talk about first is the Bludgeon Brothers versus the New Day versus the Usos. The Bludgeon Brothers were made up of Eric Rowan and Luke Harper, now known in AEW and in the independent circles as Brody Lee. His real name was John Huber, and he sadly passed away late last year of an undiagnosed lung disease. He was a great talent, and he'll be deeply missed, especially after a great tag match like this. As for the main event, I didn't love it, but it was alright. Matches you should watch: The Miz versus Finn Balor versus Seth Rollins, Randy Orton versus Robert Roode versus Rusev versus Jinder Mahal, Asuka versus Charlotte, Daniel's return, and Ronda's debut. I'm discussing every WrestleMania. Now it's time for part 35. The main event for this one was a triple threat for the SmackDown and Raw Women's Championships. It was between Becky Lynch, Ronda Rousey, and Charlotte Flair. It was the first and so far only women's match to headline WrestleMania, and fuck almighty was it good. Other matches you should check out: Daniel Bryan versus Kofi Kingston, Brock Lesnar versus Seth Rollins, the Usos versus The Bar versus Shinsuke Nakamura and Rusev versus Ricochet and Aleister Black, the Boston Hug Connection versus the Divas of Doom versus Nia Jax and Tamina versus the winners, the Iconics, a match I can't not recommend enough: Kurt Angle versus Baron Corbin. I'm discussing WrestleMania. Now we're going to discuss WrestleMania 36, Part 1. This was the first WWE pay-per-view they did during the COVID pandemic, and things got a little interesting. Very interesting. For starters, we're looking at some empty chairs at empty tables, meaning no live crowd. But also, the main event was not a traditional wrestling match. It was a cinematic match where The Undertaker basically beat the piss out of AJ Styles, and it was pretty fucking awesome, and a great way for The Undertaker to go out. But really, the whole card was great. The Kabuki Warriors versus Bliss and Cross, Shayna Baszler versus Becky Lynch, Daniel Bryan versus Sami Zayn, Kofi Kingston versus Jimmy Uso versus John Morrison, Kevin Owens versus Seth Rollins. Even Braun Strowman versus Goldberg was pretty good. Check this out. I'm discussing every WrestleMania, now we're going to discuss WrestleMania 36, Part 2. So because of the pandemic, WWE decided to split WrestleMania into a two-night event. They're doing the same thing this year, but in front of an actual crowd this time. Let's see how it works. The two most infamous matches on this card are the Firefly Funhouse, Bray Wyatt versus John Cena, and Drew McIntyre versus Brock Lesnar for the WWE Championship. While the latter is a straightforward wrestling match, the former is a David Lynch-style short film discussing the history of John Cena as a character in WWE and the real-life man's reputation as somewhat of a backstage politician. Both are great pieces of entertainment and are well worth your time. Watch the entire card, but if you only have time for those two plus one more, watch Charlotte Flair vs. Rhea Ripley. I hate the end, but it's great. We made it. I'm discussing every WrestleMania. Now I'm finally discussing WrestleMania 37. This show started with Drew McIntyre versus Bobby Lashley, and it ended with Sasha Banks versus Bianca Belair. And in the middle of all that, we had Cesaro versus Seth Rollins, Braun Strowman versus Shane McMahon, The New Day versus AJ Styles and Amos, Bad Bunny and Damian Priest versus The Miz and John Morrison, and the Tag Team Turmoil match to determine the number one contenders to the WWE Women's Tag Team Championships. It was a really great show. They were all great matches. There was one match where I thought the wrong result happened, but I can't complain too much. It was a damn great show. I can't wait for night 2. Alright, let's do this one last time. I've been discussing every WrestleMania, and now it's time for night 2 of WrestleMania 37. The main event for this one was Roman Reigns versus Edge versus Daniel Bryan. The match right before it was Asuka versus Rhea Ripley. Earlier on the card, you had Matt Riddle versus Sheamus for the United States Championship. Even earlier, you had Nia Jax and Shayna Baszler versus Natalya and Tamina for the WWE Women's Tag Team Championships. You also had Big E versus Apollo Crews for the Intercontinental Championship. And in non-title action, you had Sami versus Kevin Owens and The Fiend versus Randy Orton. All of these matches were really well worked. That said, the ones most worth your time: Roman, Edge and Daniel, Asuka and Rhea, Sami and Kevin.